The wedding invitation was ivory with gold script, the kind that whispered money before you even read the words. David and Stephanie request the pleasure of your company. I held it against the kitchen window, watching sunlight filter through the expensive cardstock, and wondered if my nephew knew what his bride-to-be had planned for me. The RSVP card had arrived separately, which should have been my first warning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Table assignment to follow, it said in Stephanie's perfect cursive. I should have known then that she'd already decided exactly where I belonged in her carefully orchestrated social hierarchy. The day of the wedding, I dressed carefully in my navy dress with the pearl buttons, the one I'd worn to David's college graduation. I'd taught high school English for 35 years at Bridgewater Academy, and if there's one thing you learn from dealing with teenagers from wealthy families, it's that presentation matters. Not because you're trying to impress anyone, but because respect starts with respecting yourself. I drove the 40 minutes from Hartford to the Riverside Country Club in Millbrook, Connecticut, listening to NPR and thinking about the boy David used to be before Stephanie convinced him that his family wasn't quite refined enough for her taste. The country club sprawled across manicured lawns like something from a magazine, all white columns and perfectly trimmed hedges. Valets in crisp uniforms directed luxury cars toward the parking area, while a small army of photographers captured every arriving guest. I handed over my keys to a young man who couldn't have been much older than my former students and walked toward the entrance, heels clicking on stone that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Inside, the reception hall had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, if fairy tales cost $40,000. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables draped in champagne-colored linens, each one adorned with towering arrangements of white roses and baby's breath. A string quartet played softly near French doors that opened onto a terrace overlooking the Connecticut River. Everything was perfect, orchestrated, designed to impress. I found the seating chart displayed on an ornate easel near the entrance, guests crowding around it like students checking test scores. I searched for my name among the elegant calligraphy. Past table 1, where the senator and her husband were seated, past tables 2 through 5, reserved for college friends and young professionals, past tables 6 through 8, filled with extended family and close friends. My finger traced down the list, past more relatives, past Stephanie's sorority sisters, past David's work colleagues. Finally, tucked in the far right corner, almost hidden behind a potted plant, I found it. Margaret Chen, table 12. Table 12 sat near the kitchen doors, where the catering staff emerged with their silver trays, and the sound of clashing dishes provided a constant backdrop. The table was positioned behind a decorative column that blocked most of the view of the head table, and the lighting here was dimmer, as if this section of the room was an afterthought. 4 other people were already seated when I arrived, and it took me only a moment to understand what Stephanie had done. Frank Kowalski, 75 years old with hands that bore the permanent stains of honest work, wore a suit that had seen better decades, but was pressed with obvious care. He'd been the janitor at the country club for 40 years before retiring, and he nodded at me with genuine warmth when I sat down. Beside him sat Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 who worked double shifts at the diner downtown, and had only been invited because her ex-husband was David's second cousin. She kept checking her phone, probably worried about her babysitter and the cost of staying out late. Tommy Nguyen, barely 20 and still in college, fidgeted with his tie and looked around the room like he'd wandered into someone else's dream by mistake. The 5th chair remained empty, a silent testament to either a last-minute cancellation or someone who'd seen the seating arrangement and decided their dignity was worth more than free dinner. I took my place between Frank and Maria, smoothing my dress and placing my small purse carefully beside my plate. The centerpiece here was smaller than the others, the flowers slightly wilted, the tablecloth bearing a small stain that someone had tried unsuccessfully to hide with strategic folding. From our table, I could see the head table where David sat beside his radiant bride, both of them glowing under the warm spotlights. Stephanie wore a dress that probably cost more than Frank's annual Social Security check, her smile perfect as she accepted congratulations from a steady stream of well-wishers. She hadn't looked in my direction once since I'd arrived, but I knew she was aware of exactly where I sat. This wasn't oversight or poor planning. This was a message, delivered with all the subtlety of a debutante who'd learned her cruelty at the finest finishing schools. My brother Robert sat at table 3 with his wife and their friends from the real estate office, close enough to the action to feel important, but not quite inner circle. He'd glanced over at me once when I sat down, his expression unreadable, but he hadn't approached. We'd had words about Stephanie before, about the way she'd gradually frozen out anyone she considered beneath her station, and Robert had chosen the path of least resistance. "Keep the peace," he'd said. "Don't rock the boat." Easy enough to say when you weren't the one being pushed overboard. The cocktail hour stretched on with the peculiar rhythm of expensive parties, where conversation flows like champagne and everyone speaks just a little louder than necessary. From our corner table, we watched the social choreography unfold. Stephanie worked the room with practiced efficiency, air-kissing her way through clusters of guests, her laugh bright and musical whenever she encountered someone particularly important. She spent considerable time with Senator Elizabeth Morrison, a distinguished woman in her 50s, whose presence had clearly elevated the entire event in Stephanie's estimation. Frank leaned over during a lull in the quartet's performance and said quietly, "That's your boy up there getting..." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Married? His voice carried the gentle authority of someone who'd spent decades observing people at their best and worst during life's major celebrations. I nodded, watching David laugh at something one of his groomsmen had whispered. "My nephew. I helped raise him after his mother died when he was 12. Frank's eyes softened with understanding. "Ah, and the bride? She's the one who decided we all belong over here in Siberia?" Maria looked up from her phone long enough to snort softly. "Honey, I've been to enough weddings to know exactly what this table means. We're the people they had to invite but didn't want to see." Tommy shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't understand why they even bothered. I mean, if they didn't want us here." "Because leaving us out entirely would have looked bad," I explained, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. "This way, they can claim they included everyone while making it clear where we stand in their hierarchy." The conversation died as a server appeared to fill our water glasses, her movements efficient and practiced. She was young, maybe Maria's age, with kind eyes that held just a hint of sympathy as she surveyed our table. After she left, Frank raised his glass in a mock toast. "Well then, here's to us nobodies," he said with a grin that held more dignity than spite. "May we continue to know the difference between class and money." We clinked glasses, and for the first time since arriving, I felt something other than humiliation. These weren't nobodies. Frank had worked honestly for 4 decades, maintaining this very building while rich people celebrated inside it. Maria was raising 3 children alone while working 2 jobs, probably more tired than anyone in this room but still here to support family. Tommy was putting himself through college, the first in his family to pursue higher education. They were good people, salt-of-the-earth people, the kind who understood that true worth wasn't measured by bank accounts or social connections. As the dinner service began, I found myself actually enjoying their company. Frank told stories about the celebrities and politicians he'd met during his years at the club, always managing to find something humanizing in each encounter. Maria shared photos of her children, her face lighting up as she described her youngest daughter's first piano recital. Tommy talked about his business major and his plans to start a nonprofit someday, his enthusiasm infectious despite his obvious discomfort with the formal setting. The food was exquisite, of course. Plates arrived bearing carefully arranged portions of salmon and beef tenderloin, accompanied by vegetables carved into precise geometric shapes. Everything tasted exactly as expensive as it looked, but the presentation felt almost absurd given our surroundings. We were eating museum-quality cuisine while sitting close enough to the kitchen to hear the dishwashers arguing in Spanish over the sound of industrial machinery. During the salad course, I noticed Senator Morrison stand and begin making her way through the room, stopping to chat with various tables. She moved with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to working crowds, spending just enough time with each group to seem engaged without lingering long enough to get trapped in lengthy conversations. She was impressive, I had to admit, carrying herself with the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of public service. As she approached our corner of the room, I expected her to bypass our table entirely, or offer the briefest of polite acknowledgments before moving on. Politicians were experts at the art of the graceful skip, after all. Instead, she paused when she reached table 12, her eyes scanning the faces around our small circle before landing on mine with unmistakable recognition. "Margaret Chen," she said, and her voice carried a warmth that surprised everyone at the table, myself included. "I thought that was you." The entire table fell silent. Frank's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, Maria's phone disappeared into her purse, and Tommy sat up straighter in his chair. I felt heat rise in my cheeks as every eye in our vicinity turned toward us, drawn by the unexpected spectacle of Senator Morrison engaging with the forgotten corner of the reception. "Senator Morrison," I replied, standing automatically as my years of teaching protocol kicked in. "How lovely to see you." She stepped closer, and I caught the subtle fragrance of her perfume. Something expensive but not overwhelming. "Please call me Elizabeth. I can't believe it's been, 15 years since Bridgewater Academy?" The recognition hit me then like a warm wave. Elizabeth Morrison had been Elizabeth Hartwell when I'd known her, a concerned parent who'd spent countless hours in my classroom discussing her daughter Grace's college applications. Grace had been one of my brightest students, a girl who'd struggled with confidence despite her obvious intelligence. Her mother had been equally impressive, already involved in local politics, but still making time for every parent-teacher conference and school event. "Grace is doing wonderfully, by the way," Elizabeth continued, seemingly oblivious to the growing attention our conversation was attracting. "She's my chief of staff now, can you believe it? She still talks about the essay you helped her write for her Harvard application." Around us, the subtle conversations at nearby tables had quieted as people strained to overhear. I could feel Stephanie's gaze burning across the room like a laser, her perfect composure beginning to crack as she watched her carefully orchestrated social hierarchy suddenly shift beneath her feet. "I always knew Grace would do great things," I said, my voice carrying more clearly now as my initial surprise gave way to genuine pleasure at the unexpected reunion. She had such a keen mind for analysis and such compassion for others, perfect qualities for public service. Elizabeth beamed with the pride only a mother could feel. "She credits you with teaching her how to write with both precision and heart. She said you were the first teacher who made her believe her voice mattered." The compliment settled over me like sunshine, warming places that had been cold since I'd first seen my table assignment. This was why I'd taught for 35 years, these moments when you discovered that something you'd given had taken root and grown into something beautiful. Grace Hartwell had been a quiet, thoughtful girl who'd needed encouragement more than instruction, and apparently that encouragement had helped shape the woman who now advised a United States senator. "I hope she knows how proud I am of her," I said. "And of you, of course. Your work on education reform has been remarkable." Elizabeth's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found an unexpected ally. "Actually, that's something I've been wanting to discuss with someone who has real classroom experience. The theoretical side is one thing, but I need perspectives from educators who've actually lived these challenges." She paused, glancing around our table with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. Frank had set down his fork entirely now, watching the exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing a magic trick. Maria smiled encouragingly, and Tommy looked like he was watching a tennis match, his head turning between Elizabeth and me with each exchange. "You know what?" Elizabeth said suddenly, her voice taking on the decisive tone that had probably served her well in the Senate. "Would it be terribly presumptuous of me to ask if I could join you all for dinner? I'd love to continue this conversation, and frankly, this looks like the most interesting table in the room." The question hung in the air like a soap bubble, beautiful and impossible. Frank recovered first, his years of customer service kicking in, as he stood and gestured toward the empty chair beside me. "Senator, it would be our honor," he said with a dignity that made me proud to share his table. "Though I should warn you, We're not exactly the VIP section over here." Elizabeth laughed, a genuine sound that carried none of the calculated charm I'd observed from politicians before. "Frank, isn't it? I remember you from my daughter's graduation party here years ago. You helped us find Grace's lost earring in the parking lot." Frank's face flushed with pleased surprise. "You remember that?" "I remember kindness," Elizabeth said simply, settling into the chair beside me with the ease of someone comfortable in any social situation. "It's rarer than people think." As Elizabeth took her seat at our table, I watched the ripple effect spread across the reception hall like stones dropped in still water. Conversations paused at nearby tables, heads turned subtly in our direction, and a low murmur of confusion began to build. At the head table, Stephanie's smile had frozen into something resembling a porcelain mask, her eyes wide with what I could only describe as panic. The transformation was immediate and profound. Suddenly, our table near the kitchen didn't feel like exile anymore. It felt like the center of attention, the place where something interesting was happening, while everyone else continued their predictable small talk about vacation homes and stock portfolios. Elizabeth's presence had alchemy-like powers, turning our gathering of supposed nobodies into the most compelling conversation in the room. Elizabeth settled into her chair with the natural confidence of someone who belonged wherever she chose to sit. Within moments, she had Tommy explaining his nonprofit dreams with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen from him all evening, while Maria found herself discussing the challenges of working families with someone who actually listened to the answers. Frank regaled us with stories from his decades at the club, and Elizabeth laughed at his observations about the wealthy patrons, with the delight of someone hearing insider secrets. What struck me most was how effortlessly she drew each person out, asking follow-up questions that showed genuine interest rather than polite obligation. When Tommy mentioned his scholarship struggles, she nodded knowingly and shared her own experience of working 3 jobs to put herself through law school. When Maria worried aloud about her daughter's math grades, Elizabeth immediately offered the name of a tutoring program she'd helped establish for single-parent families. Meanwhile, the rest of the reception continued around us with increasing awkwardness. I could see other guests glancing over with poorly concealed confusion, their careful social calculations suddenly thrown into chaos. Why was Senator Morrison sitting with the help and the distant relatives? What did she know that they didn't? The whispered conversations at nearby tables grew more animated as people tried to decode what was happening at table 12. Stephanie's composure finally cracked during the salad course, when she excused herself from the head table and approached our corner with the determined stride of someone used to controlling every variable in her environment. She wore her brightest smile, the one I'd seen her practice in mirrors during family gatherings, but her eyes held the sharp focus of a predator who'd spotted something threatening her territory. "Senator Morrison," she said, her voice pitched perfectly to carry just the right note of delighted surprise. "What a wonderful surprise to see you found Margaret. I hope she's not boring you with too many teaching stories." The insult was wrapped in silk but unmistakable, designed to remind everyone present that I was just a retired schoolteacher who probably didn't understand the appropriate boundaries of conversation with important people. Elizabeth's response was immediate and devastating in its simplicity. "On the contrary," she said, her senatorial training evident in the way she could project warmth while simultaneously creating distance. "Margaret and I have been having the most fascinating discussion about educational policy. She's been sharing insights from her years at Bridgewater Academy that I wish more of my colleagues in Washington could hear." Stephanie's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Oh, how nice. Well, I just wanted to make sure you knew you're welcome to join us at the head table if you'd prefer. I know how important networking can be at these events." The offer hung between them like a chess move, simultaneously generous and calculated. Elizabeth could accept graciously and restore the proper social order, or she could decline and risk appearing rude to her host. I held my breath, suddenly aware of how much this moment mattered, not just for me, but for Frank and Maria and Tommy, for every person who'd ever been dismissed based on their bank account or job title. Elizabeth took a sip of her wine, considering the offer with the deliberate pace of someone who understood the weight of political moments. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years making decisions that affected millions of lives. "That's very kind of you, Stephanie, but I'm exactly where I want to be," she said. In fact, I was just thinking how refreshing it is to have dinner with people who do meaningful work rather than just talk about it. The comment landed like a perfectly aimed arrow, polite enough to avoid offense but pointed enough to make its message clear. Stephanie's face went through a series of micro-expressions, surprise giving way to confusion, and then to something approaching anger, before settling back into her practiced smile. Of course, she managed. Well, please let me know if you need anything at all. She retreated to the head table with her dignity intact, but her power clearly diminished, leaving our corner of the room feeling somehow larger and more significant than before. Frank let out a low whistle once she was out of earshot. Well, that was something, he said, his eyes twinkling with amusement. Haven't seen someone handle a power play that smoothly since I watched the mayor's wife put down the country club president's attempts to ban minorities from the golf course. Elizabeth chuckled. Politics teaches you that the most effective responses are often the quietest ones. Sometimes the best way to win is simply to refuse to play by someone else's rules. As the main course arrived, our table had somehow become the most animated corner of the reception. Other guests were now openly staring, and I caught glimpses of people checking their phones, probably Googling who Margaret Chen was and why Senator Morrison was spending her evening in our company. The irony wasn't lost on me that Stephanie's attempt to humiliate me had inadvertently made me the most interesting person at her own wedding. The conversation flowed as naturally as wine, jumping from education reform to small business challenges to the importance of community support systems. Elizabeth shared stories from her early days in politics, when she'd run for city council as a young single mother fighting for better schools and safer neighborhoods. Tommy talked about growing up in a family where college seemed impossible until teachers like me convinced him otherwise. Maria described the delicate balance of working multiple jobs while trying to be present for her children's important moments. Through it all, I found myself thinking about the strange turns life takes, the way moments of humiliation can transform into opportunities for grace if you're willing to see them clearly. Stephanie had seated me here to diminish me, to make me understand my place in her carefully constructed hierarchy. Instead, she'd given me the chance to remember who I really was and what I'd actually accomplished during my years in the classroom. During a brief pause in the conversation, Elizabeth turned to me with a more serious expression. Margaret, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what made you decide to retire from teaching? Grace always said you were one of those educators who could have taught forever. The question touched something deep and complicated, a mixture of pride and regret that I'd been carrying since leaving Bridgewater Academy 3 years earlier. Teaching had been more than my career. It had been my calling, my identity, the thing that defined me more than any other aspect of my life. Letting go had been like losing a piece of myself. Honestly, I said, swirling the wine in my glass as I chose my words carefully, I probably could have taught for several more years physically, but the profession was changing in ways that made it harder to do the work that mattered most to me. Elizabeth nodded knowingly. The testing pressures? Administrative demands? All of that, plus the increasing focus on metrics over relationships, I replied. I spent my career believing that education was about teaching young people to think critically, to write clearly, to understand their place in the larger world. But toward the end, it felt like I was training them to perform well on assessments rather than preparing them for life. Tommy leaned forward with the intensity of someone who'd recently navigated the system I was describing. That's exactly what high school felt like for me. Like we were products on an assembly line instead of people learning to become adults. The standardized testing culture has done tremendous damage, Elizabeth agreed, her voice taking on the passionate edge she probably used during committee hearings. We've reduced learning to data points and forgotten that education is fundamentally about human development. Maria nodded emphatically. I see it with my kids every day. They come home stressed about test scores instead of excited about what they learned. My youngest is 8 years old and already worried about whether she's smart enough. The conversation continued with the kind of depth and substance that I'd been craving for years but rarely found in social settings. These people understood that education wasn't just policy or politics. It was personal, affecting every family and shaping every community. Elizabeth took notes on her phone as we talked, asking detailed questions about classroom realities that senators rarely heard during formal hearings. As dessert arrived, elegant individual chocolate tarts that probably cost more than Maria spent on groceries in a week, I realized something profound had happened during the course of our meal. What had begun as exile had become elevation. Stephanie's attempt to marginalize me had instead provided a platform to share my expertise with someone who could actually use it to make a difference. The irony deepened when I noticed David approaching our table, his expression uncertain as he navigated between his loyalty to his new wife and his obvious curiosity about why Senator Morrison was holding court in what was supposed to be the forgotten corner of his reception. He'd loosened his tie and his hair was slightly mussed from dancing, making him look more like the boy I'd helped raise than the polished groom he'd been all evening. "Aunt Maggie," he said as he reached our table, his voice carrying a note of apology that hadn't been there during our stilted conversations over the past few months. "I wanted to come say hello and see how you're enjoying everything." The question was loaded with subtext, an acknowledgement that he knew exactly what table assignment meant and perhaps some recognition that his bride's social engineering had backfired spectacularly. Elizabeth looked up at him with interest, and I realized she was seeing the family dynamics play out in real time. "David," I said warmly, standing to give him the hug I'd been hoping for all evening. "Come meet my new friends. This is Senator Morrison, who you might remember hearing about, and Frank, Maria, and Tommy." David shook hands around the table with the good manners I'd helped instill in him, but his eyes kept returning to Elizabeth, with the slightly starstruck expression of someone meeting genuine celebrity. When she mentioned that she remembered him from his high school graduation ceremony, his face lit up with surprised pleasure. "You were there?" he asked. "I remember seeing you in the audience, but I figured you were there for one of your own kids." "Grace graduated that year too," Elizabeth explained. "But I remember your speech about the teachers who'd made a difference in your life. You mentioned your Aunt Maggie quite prominently." David's face flushed, and he glanced at me with something approaching shame. "She practically raised me after Mom died. I don't know where I'd be without her." The acknowledgement hung in the air like a bridge between past and present, a recognition of bonds that predated his marriage and social aspirations. Elizabeth smiled encouragingly, sensing the emotional undercurrent, but graciously avoiding any commentary on family dynamics. "She's been telling us about her teaching philosophy," Elizabeth said. "I have to say, if more educators thought the way your aunt does, we'd have far fewer problems in our schools." David nodded emphatically. "She used to help me with essays by asking questions instead of giving answers. Drove me crazy at the time, but I learned to think for myself because of it." "That's the mark of a truly gifted teacher," Elizabeth replied. "Anyone can provide information, but it takes real skill to develop critical thinking." As David rejoined the conversation, I felt the final piece of the evening's puzzle click into place. Stephanie had tried to isolate me, to make me feel small and insignificant in the face of her grand celebration. Instead, she'd created the exact conditions for me to shine, surrounded by people who valued substance over style and genuine accomplishment over social status. The reception continued around us, but our table had become its own universe, a pocket of authentic conversation in a sea of polite small talk. Other guests began finding excuses to walk past our corner, hoping to catch fragments of whatever discussion was keeping Senator Morrison so engaged. I noticed Stephanie watching from across the room, her earlier confidence replaced by something approaching panic, as she realized her carefully orchestrated evening was spinning beyond her control. Frank, ever observant, leaned over during a lull in the conversation and whispered, "You know what the best part of this is? She thought she was putting us in our place, but all she did was show everyone else where the real class in this room was sitting." He was right, of course. True dignity couldn't be assigned by seating charts or diminished by social slights. It came from knowing your own worth and living it quietly, without need for external validation or fear of others' opinions. Stephanie had wielded her social power like a weapon, but she'd forgotten that real influence comes from character, not calculation. As the evening wound toward its close, Elizabeth exchanged contact information with each of us, promising to follow up on various initiatives we'd discussed. She invited me to speak at an upcoming education forum, asked Maria about participating in a working families roundtable, and encouraged Tommy to apply for a congressional internship. What had started as punishment had become opportunity, transformation emerging from what was meant to be humiliation. The wedding reception that was supposed to put me in my place had instead reminded me exactly where I belonged, not in any particular social stratum, but among people who understood that worth comes from contribution, not accumulation. Stephanie's attempt to diminish me had illuminated instead the difference between having power and earning respect, between commanding attention and deserving it. As guests began to leave and the evening drew to its close, I sat back in my chair at table 12 and smiled. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, but simply the quiet satisfaction of knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone else define it for you. The Nobodies table had become the place where something real had happened, where connections were made and ideas were shared, where dignity had triumphed over calculation in the most elegant way possible. The days following the wedding brought an unexpected avalanche of consequences that I doubt Stephanie had anticipated when she'd made her calculated seating decision. Word travels fast in Connecticut social circles, especially when it involves a sitting senator choosing to spend an entire wedding reception at what everyone understood to be the least desirable table in the room. By Monday morning, my phone was ringing with calls from people I hadn't heard from in years. The first call came from Grace Patterson herself, Elizabeth's daughter and chief of staff, her voice warm with the kind of affection that made me remember why teaching had been such a privilege. She'd heard about the reception from her mother and wanted to personally extend an invitation to speak at the upcoming National Education Summit in Washington. The irony wasn't lost on me that Stephanie's attempt to embarrass me had instead opened doors to influence policy discussions at the highest levels of government. Grace's voice carried excitement as she outlined the speaking opportunity. Mom said you had insights about classroom realities that politicians never hear, because they're too busy talking to administrators and lobbyists instead of actual teachers. We need voices like yours in these conversations. The invitation felt surreal, like discovering that a wrong turn had led to exactly where you needed to be. After years of feeling like my experience and expertise were becoming obsolete, suddenly people in positions of real power wanted to hear what I had to say. I accepted immediately, my mind already spinning with ideas about what messages might actually help improve education for children like Tommy, kids from families where college seemed impossible until someone believed in them. The second call was more surprising. Robert, my brother, sounded strained and tired when he reached out Tuesday afternoon. He'd been fielding questions from mutual acquaintances about why his sister had been seated at the back table, while simultaneously networking with senators. Stephanie, apparently, was furious about what she perceived as deliberate sabotage of her perfect wedding, and the tension was affecting their household in ways that extended far beyond social embarrassment. "She's convinced you planned the whole thing somehow," Robert said, his voice carrying a weariness that suggested this conversation had been ongoing for days. "Like you arranged for Senator Morrison to sit with you just to make her look bad." I found myself laughing, not with malice but with genuine amusement at the absurdity of the accusation. "Robert, do you really think I have the kind of political connections to orchestrate senator behavior at weddings?" Elizabeth Morrison sat with us because she remembered me as her daughter's teacher, not because of some elaborate revenge plot. The silence on his end stretched long enough for me to hear the tick of the grandfather clock in my living room, a sound that had become more noticeable since retiring, when the house felt too quiet some days. When Robert finally spoke again, his voice carried a note of something I couldn't quite identify, maybe regret or recognition. "I know," he said quietly. "But she's not thinking clearly right now. She spent months planning every detail of that wedding, and she feels like the attention got hijacked by something she couldn't control. The attention got redirected toward meaningful conversation instead of surface pleasantries," I replied, feeling a spark of the old teacher authority in my voice. "If she considers that a problem, that says more about her priorities than mine." Robert sighed heavily. "Margaret, I'm not calling to take sides. I'm calling because I'm worried about the family. David's caught in the middle, and Stephanie's talking about limiting contact with people who undermine their social standing." The threat was clear enough, wrapped in Robert's diplomatic language, but unmistakable in its implications. Choose loyalty to Stephanie's version of events, or risk losing access to the nephew I'd helped raise. It was manipulation presented as family harmony, the same pattern that had been building for months but now crystallized into an ultimatum. "Tell me something, Robert," I said, settling deeper into my armchair and watching a cardinal land on the bird feeder outside my window. "When you think about David's wedding, what do you remember most? The expensive flowers and crystal chandeliers? Or the fact that Senator Morrison spent the entire evening learning about education policy from his aunt?" Another long pause. The cardinal flew away, leaving the feeder swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. "I remember being proud of you," he admitted finally. "Proud that Elizabeth Morrison thought you were worth her time. Proud that David looked happier talking to you than he had all evening." "Then trust that feeling," I replied. "Because that's what actually happened, regardless of how Stephanie chooses to rewrite the story." The conversation ended without resolution, but I sensed a shift in Robert's perspective, a recognition that maybe the problem wasn't my behavior but his new daughter-in-law's expectations. Family dynamics rarely change overnight, but seeds of doubt had been planted in fertile ground, watered by years of increasing discomfort with Stephanie's social engineering. Wednesday brought the most interesting development yet. David appeared at my door just after dinner, still wearing his work clothes but with the rumpled appearance of someone who'd been carrying stress for days. He looked older somehow, as if the wedding and its aftermath had forced him to confront realities he'd been avoiding through careful denial. "Can we talk?" he asked, and his voice carried the same tentative quality I remembered from when he was 16 and needed to confess some teenage transgression that required adult guidance. I led him to the kitchen, the heart of every important conversation in my house, and put the kettle on for tea. He sat at the table where I'd helped him with homework for years, his fingers drumming nervously against the familiar wooden surface scarred by decades of family meals and study sessions. "Stephanie's upset about the wedding," he began, stating the obvious with the careful precision of someone testing dangerous waters. "She feels like you deliberately caused a scene to embarrass her." I measured tea leaves into the pot, taking my time to consider my response. David needed honesty, but he also needed space to reach his own conclusions, rather than having them imposed by his defensive aunt or manipulative wife. "David," I said finally, turning to face him while the water heated, "do you remember what you told Senator Morrison about me helping you with essays by asking questions instead of giving answers?" He nodded, confusion flickering across his features. "I'm going to ask you some questions now, and I want you to think carefully about the answers. Who decided where I should sit at your wedding?" "Stephanie handled all the seating arrangements," he replied slowly. "Where was I seated and who else was at my table?" David's face flushed slightly. "Table 12, near the kitchen. Frank from the country club, Maria Santos, and my cousin Tommy. When Senator Morrison sat down with us, did I invite her, or did she choose to join us on her own?" "She chose to," he admitted, his voice growing quieter. "And what did we spend the evening discussing? Gossip about other guests, or substantive conversation about education and public service?" The questions hung between us like stepping stones across a river of confusion and conflicting loyalties. David stared at his hands, working through the logic that led to uncomfortable conclusions about his wife's motives and methods. "She said you must have known Senator Morrison would be there," he said finally, grasping for explanations that might preserve his worldview. "But you probably arranged to sit near her somehow." I poured the hot water over the tea leaves, letting the silence stretch while the implications of that theory settled. "David, think about what you're suggesting. Are you saying I have the power to manipulate a sitting U.S. senator into abandoning the head table at your wedding to sit with the unwanted relatives? And if I had that kind of influence, why would I need to use it for something so petty?" He looked up at me with eyes that held the same confusion I'd seen when he was 12, and trying to understand why his mother wouldn't be coming home from the hospital. Some realizations come slowly, built from accumulated evidence rather than sudden revelation. "I don't understand why she put you at that table," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You helped plan the engagement party. You co-signed my car loan. You've been there for every important moment of my life. It doesn't make sense." The tea was ready, and I poured 2 cups, adding honey to both the way I'd done countless times during his adolescence. Some rituals carry weight beyond their simple actions, creating space for difficult conversations through familiar comfort. Sometimes people make decisions based on what they think will benefit them rather than what's fair or kind, I said, choosing my words carefully. And sometimes those decisions reveal more about their character than they intended. David accepted his tea with hands that trembled slightly, whether from emotion or caffeine withdrawal I couldn't tell. She said the table assignments were about creating good conversation groups, mixing different types of people. And do you think that's what happened? Did putting the retired janitor, the single mother working 2 jobs, the college student, and the retired teacher together create the kind of conversation group she was hoping for? He stared into his tea as if the answers might be floating among the leaves. You had the most interesting table at the entire reception, he said finally. Everyone was talking about it afterward. People kept asking who you were and how you knew Senator Morrison. Your aunt, Margaret Chen, who taught high school English for 35 years and happened to have taught the senator's daughter, I replied simply. The same person I've always been. The kitchen fell quiet except for the steady tick of the wall clock and the occasional car passing on the street outside. David sat with the weight of recognition settling on his shoulders, the understanding that his new wife had tried to diminish someone he loved, and had instead created the conditions for that person to shine brighter than intended. I think I need to have a conversation with Stephanie, he said eventually, his voice carrying new resolve. About respect and family and what kind of people we want to be. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine, feeling the warmth of connection that had been missing for months as Stephanie gradually erected barriers between us. That's your decision to make, David, but remember that marriage is about building something together, not tearing other people down to make yourselves feel elevated. He finished his tea and stood to leave, but paused at the kitchen door with the same expression he'd worn as a teenager, when grappling with complex moral questions that didn't have easy answers. Aunt Maggie, I'm sorry, he said, and the words carried weight far beyond the specific incident. For the seating arrangement, for not standing up for you, for letting things get this far without saying anything. I stood and hugged him properly for the first time since before his engagement, feeling the solid reality of family bonds that couldn't be erased by social maneuvering or wounded pride. Apologies matter, David, but actions matter more. Make sure your choices going forward reflect the values you want to live by. After he left, I sat in my living room with a glass of wine and thought about the strange trajectory of the past week. Stephanie's attempt to humiliate me had instead reminded me of my worth, connected me with opportunities for meaningful work, and possibly salvaged my relationship with my nephew. Sometimes the cruelest intentions create the conditions for grace to emerge, like flowers growing through cracks in concrete. Thursday morning brought yet another unexpected phone call, this time from Lisa Thompson, the wedding planner who had worked so closely with Stephanie on every detail of the reception. Her voice was professional, but carried an undercurrent of something that sounded almost like admiration. Mrs. Chen, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to reach out about Saturday evening. I've been planning weddings for 8 years, and I've never seen anything quite like what happened at your table. The comment surprised me. Wedding planners typically stayed neutral about family dynamics, focusing on logistics rather than interpersonal drama. Lisa's call suggested something beyond professional courtesy. It was certainly an interesting evening, I replied carefully, unsure where the conversation was heading. Mrs. Chen, I need you to know that I advised against that seating arrangement, Lisa said, her voice gaining strength as she continued. I told Stephanie that putting you at table 12 would look petty and reflect poorly on her hosting abilities. But she insisted, and frankly, the client gets what the client wants, even when it's a mistake. The revelation hit me like cold water. Someone had tried to prevent the humiliation, had recognized it for what it was, and attempted to intervene. The knowledge that not everyone had been complicit in Stephanie's social engineering felt like vindication I hadn't realized I needed. I appreciate you telling me that, I said, though I have to say, things worked out rather well in the end. Lisa laughed, and I could hear genuine delight in the sound. That's what I'm calling about. The story is all over the wedding planning community already. A bride tries to embarrass her husband's family member and instead creates the most talked about reception moment of the year. Senator Morrison, abandoning the head table to sit with the people the bride considered unimportant? It's legendary. The idea that my experience had become cautionary tale in wedding planning circles added another layer of irony to the entire situation. Stephanie's perfect day had indeed become memorable, just not in the way she'd intended. Are you getting calls about it? I asked, curious about the professional impact. 3 new clients this week, all specifically mentioning that they want their weddings to be about inclusion and meaningful conversation rather than social hierarchy, Lisa replied. They don't want to be known as the bride who embarrassed herself by trying to embarrass others. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Lisa sharing stories about other weddings where family dynamics had created unexpected drama. By the time we hung up, I understood that Stephanie's behavior had damaged her reputation in ways that extended far beyond our immediate family circle. Friday afternoon brought the final piece of the week's revelations. Frank Kowalski called to invite me to dinner at his modest apartment, saying he wanted to introduce me to his daughter Sarah, who taught 4th grade at an inner-city school in Hartford. The invitation felt like an unexpected gift, a reminder that genuine connections often emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. Frank's apartment was small but immaculate, filled with photographs of children and grandchildren alongside mementos from his decades of service at the country club. Sarah arrived shortly after I did, a woman in her 40s with her father's kind eyes and the tired but determined expression of someone fighting important battles on inadequate resources. Over a simple dinner of pot roast and vegetables, Sarah shared stories about her classroom that reminded me why I loved teaching and why Elizabeth Morrison's Education Summit mattered so much. Her students faced challenges that went far beyond academic preparation, arriving at school hungry or worried about family situations that would overwhelm most adults. What struck me about Saturday night, Sarah said as we cleared the dinner plates, was watching you and Senator Morrison have the kind of conversation about education that actually matters. Usually when politicians talk about schools, they're talking about statistics and budgets. You were talking about children. The observation resonated deeply, highlighting the difference between policy discussions conducted in abstracts and the messy reality of individual lives affected by those policies. My upcoming speaking opportunity in Washington suddenly felt more significant, weighted with responsibility to represent voices that typically went unheard in political chambers. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the strange week that had transformed humiliation into opportunity, isolation into connection, and attempted diminishment into unexpected elevation. Stephanie had tried to write me out of the story of David's wedding, relegating me to the margins where inconvenient people were supposed to remain quietly invisible. Instead, she had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for me to remember who I was and what I had to offer. The Nobodies table had become the place where something real happened, where genuine conversation flourished, where a retired teacher reconnected with her sense of purpose and possibility. Sometimes the best revenge truly is living well, and sometimes the people who try to diminish us end up providing exactly the platform we need to shine. Table 12 had been intended as exile, but it had become elevation. The wedding reception that was supposed to put me in my place had instead reminded me that my place was wherever I chose to make meaningful contributions to the world around me. The Education Summit in Washington arrived faster than I'd expected, bringing with it a level of nervous energy I hadn't felt since my first day of teaching decades earlier. Grace Patterson had arranged for me to stay at a boutique hotel near Capitol Hill, the kind of place where senators and lobbyists conducted quiet conversations over expensive coffee. Walking through the marble lobby with my simple suitcase and practical shoes, I felt simultaneously out of place and exactly where I belonged. The summit itself was held in a conference center that buzzed with the particular energy of people who believed they could change the world through the right combination of policy and persistence. Attendees ranged from education researchers and think tank analysts to school board members and classroom teachers, creating a diverse mix that reminded me of the best faculty meetings I'd attended during my years at Bridgewater Academy. Elizabeth Morrison had arranged for me to speak on a panel titled, "Classroom Realities: What Politicians Need to Know." The other panelists included a principal from Chicago, a special education coordinator from rural Montana, and a superintendent from suburban Phoenix. Looking at the agenda, I realized that Grace had positioned me as the voice of experienced classroom practice, someone who could speak to the daily realities that policy papers often missed. The morning of my presentation, I stood in front of the hotel mirror wearing my best navy suit and the pearl earrings Tom had given me for our anniversary, feeling the weight of representing not just my own experience, but the voices of countless colleagues who'd never have opportunities like this. The reflection looking back at me showed a woman who'd found her purpose again, someone who'd remembered that expertise earned through decades of dedicated service had value that couldn't be diminished by social slights or family politics. The panel discussion exceeded my expectations in ways that reminded me why teaching had been such a fulfilling career. When I spoke about the difference between data-driven instruction and relationship-based learning, heads nodded throughout the audience. When I described how standardized testing had crowded out critical thinking development, several people took notes with the intensity of students preparing for final exams. But the moment that crystallized everything came during the question and answer session, when a young congressional staffer asked how politicians could better understand the real challenges facing public education. Without hesitation, I found myself telling the story of Tommy Nagyan, the college student who'd sat at table 12 just 2 weeks earlier. I described how Tommy represented thousands of first-generation college students who succeeded not because of testing metrics or administrative efficiency, but because individual teachers took personal interest in their potential. I explained how his presence at that wedding table had reminded me that education's true purpose wasn't producing data points, but developing human beings capable of contributing meaningfully to society. The audience listened with rapt attention as I connected Tommy's story to broader policy implications, arguing that educational success should be measured not just by test scores but by graduates' ability to think critically, communicate effectively, and engage constructively with diverse perspectives. When I finished speaking, the applause lasted longer than protocol typically allowed, and I knew something important had been communicated. After the panel ended, I found myself surrounded by people wanting to continue the conversation. A researcher from Stanford asked for my contact information to discuss a longitudinal study about teacher retention. A foundation director invited me to join an advisory committee focused on supporting educators in high-poverty schools. Most surprisingly, a documentary filmmaker approached me about participating in a project examining the intersection of social class and educational opportunity. During a break between sessions, Grace Patterson appeared at my elbow, with the satisfied expression of someone whose strategic planning had paid off exactly as intended. Her resemblance to her mother was striking, not just in physical features, but in the way she carried herself with quiet confidence and genuine warmth. "That was extraordinary," she said, guiding me toward a quiet corner where we could talk without interruption. "You managed to make policy personal without being sentimental, and statistical without being cold. Mom said you were gifted at finding the human story in complex issues, but seeing it in action was something else entirely." The compliment meant more coming from Grace than from strangers, carrying the weight of someone who'd known me during her formative years and could appreciate the full trajectory of my career. She'd been one of those students who'd seemed unremarkable during her junior year, struggling with confidence despite obvious intelligence, until something clicked during senior year and she'd blossomed into the kind of leader who could advise senators. "Your mother mentioned that you credit our work together with helping you find your voice," I said. "But honestly, Grace, I think you would have discovered that voice regardless. Some people are born to lead, they just need the right encouragement to trust their instincts." Grace smiled with the particular warmth that develops between teacher and student when time has proven the relationship's lasting value. "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. Mom has an idea, and she asked me to run it by you before she brings it up officially." The conversation that followed changed the trajectory of my retirement in ways I could never have anticipated. Elizabeth Morrison, apparently, had been developing a comprehensive education reform proposal that would require extensive consultation with experienced educators who understood both classroom realities and systemic challenges. She needed someone who could bridge the gap between academic theory and practical application, someone with credibility among teachers but also the communication skills to engage with policymakers. "She wants to offer you a consulting position," Grace explained, her voice carrying excitement that suggested she'd been instrumental in developing this opportunity. "Part-time, flexible schedule, but substantive work that could influence national education policy. You'd be working directly with her office to develop legislation that actually reflects what teachers and students need." The offer felt surreal, like discovering that a wrong turn had led not just to an interesting destination, but to exactly where I'd been meant to go all along. After years of feeling like my expertise was becoming obsolete, suddenly people at the highest levels of government wanted to tap into the knowledge I'd accumulated through decades of daily interaction with students and families. "There's one condition," Grace added with a mischievous smile that reminded me of her teenage years. "You'd need to relocate to Washington for at least part of the year. Mom wants you close enough for regular consultation, not just occasional phone calls." The practical implications hit me immediately. Leaving Connecticut would mean leaving the house Tom and I had shared for 30 years, the garden I'd tended through every season, the familiar rhythms of a life I'd built carefully around retirement routines. But staying would mean passing up the chance to influence policy in ways that could benefit students like Tommy and teachers like Sarah, Frank's daughter, who was fighting important battles with inadequate resources. I asked for time to consider the offer, and Grace graciously agreed, understanding that major life decisions required more than enthusiasm to sustain them. The rest of the summit passed in a blur of productive conversations and unexpected connections, each interaction reinforcing my sense that this opportunity represented more than career advancement. It felt like purpose rediscovered, a chance to make the kind of difference I'd always hoped my teaching would have, but on a scale I'd never imagined possible. The flight back to Hartford gave me time to process the emotional whirlwind of the past few weeks. Stephanie's wedding seating chart had been intended to diminish me, to make me feel small and irrelevant in the face of her grand social aspirations. Instead, it had created the exact conditions necessary for me to reconnect with my sense of worth and discover new possibilities for meaningful work. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. The woman who'd tried to erase me from family celebrations had inadvertently provided the catalyst for the most significant professional opportunity of my life. Table 12, intended as exile, had become the launching pad for adventures I'd never anticipated during my careful retirement planning. Returning to my quiet house in Hartford felt strange after the energizing chaos of Washington. The familiar rooms seemed smaller somehow, not because they'd physically changed, but because my perspective had expanded to accommodate possibilities I hadn't previously considered. I found myself walking through spaces that had felt like sanctuary just weeks earlier, and seeing them now as comfortable constraints rather than chosen refuge. The decision-making process stretched over several days, complicated by practical considerations and emotional attachments that pulled in different directions. My house represented stability and history, filled with memories of Tom and decades of family gatherings, but Washington represented the chance to influence policy discussions that could improve educational outcomes for millions of students. The opportunity to ensure that voices like mine were heard in places where critical decisions were made. The clarity came unexpectedly while I was working in my garden, hands deep in soil that I'd been tending for years with the satisfaction that comes from creating beauty through consistent care. As I transplanted seedlings that would bloom long after I'd moved away, I realized that the best gardens aren't hoarded by their creators, but shared with others who can appreciate and continue their growth. My expertise in education was like those seedlings, valuable not because I possessed it, but because of what it could become when planted in fertile ground, and tended by people with resources to help it flourish. Keeping that knowledge contained in my comfortable retirement would be like refusing to share seeds that could create gardens in places desperately needing beauty and growth. The phone call to Grace Patterson felt like stepping off a cliff into freefall, exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. Her delight at my acceptance was infectious, immediately launching into practical discussions about timing, housing options, and the specific projects I'd be working on during my initial months in Washington. "Mom is going to be thrilled," Grace said, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. "She's been saying since the wedding that you were exactly the kind of voice missing from education policy discussions. Smart, experienced, and completely unimpressed by political theater." The comment about being unimpressed by political theater made me laugh, thinking about how my perspective on power and influence had been shaped by decades of managing teenagers from wealthy families. After dealing with 16-year-olds convinced of their own importance, senators and lobbyists seemed remarkably manageable by comparison. Breaking the news to my family proved more complicated than accepting the job offer. Robert's reaction was predictably mixed, excitement about my professional recognition tempered by concern about family cohesion, and Stephanie's likely response to yet another development that put me in a positive spotlight. She's still upset about the wedding, he warned during our phone conversation, his voice carrying the weariness of someone navigating ongoing domestic tension. This is going to feel like you're being rewarded for embarrassing her, even though that's not what happened. David's response was unqualifiedly supportive, his voice carrying pride that reminded me of his childhood reactions to my teaching awards and recognition. Aunt Maggie, this is incredible. You're going to be advising senators about education policy? That's like the ultimate teaching position. His enthusiasm felt like vindication for all the years I'd invested in his development, proof that the values I'd tried to instill had taken root despite the recent complications introduced by his marriage. When he mentioned planning to visit me in Washington once I was settled, I sensed that our relationship was not only surviving Stephanie's social engineering, but potentially growing stronger because of the challenges we'd navigated together. The most surprising reaction came from Frank Kowalski, who called to congratulate me after hearing the news through David's proud sharing of my accomplishment. His voice carried genuine delight mixed with something that sounded almost like vindication. "You know what this proves?" he said with the satisfaction of someone whose point had been dramatically validated. "Character always rises to the surface eventually. That girl tried to bury you at the back table, but all she did was give you the perfect platform to show who you really are." Frank's observation crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't articulated clearly. Stephanie's attempted humiliation had indeed provided a platform, but not because of any strategic planning on my part. It had worked because authenticity tends to attract recognition from people who value substance over style, creating connections that transcend artificial social hierarchies. The practical aspects of relocating to Washington proved less daunting than the emotional ones. Elizabeth Morrison's office helped arrange temporary housing in a furnished apartment near Capitol Hill, close enough to walk to meetings but far enough from the political circus to maintain some perspective on the work's larger purpose. Packing my Connecticut house felt like editing a life story, deciding which chapters deserve space in the next phase, and which could be lovingly archived for future reference. I kept Tom's photograph and the letters from former students, packed my favorite books, and the quilt my mother had made, but left behind the accumulated decorative objects that had felt important during my settling in years, but seemed less essential now. The hardest decision involved my garden, which I'd tended with the kind of devotion usually reserved for children or art projects. Ultimately, I arranged for a neighbor to maintain it while I was away, understanding that some beautiful things deserve preservation even when their creators move on to new creative challenges. Sarah, Frank's daughter, helped me pack boxes with the efficient energy of someone accustomed to managing complex logistics on limited time. As we worked, she shared her excitement about having a former colleague positioned to influence education policy from the inside, someone who understood that the best reforms support teachers rather than replacing them with systems and algorithms. "You're going to be our voice in rooms where decisions get made," she said while carefully wrapping my favorite coffee mug in newspaper. "That's worth more than any amount of money they could spend on new programs." Her comment reminded me that this opportunity carried responsibility extending far beyond my personal satisfaction or professional advancement. Teachers like Sarah were fighting important battles with inadequate support, implementing policies designed by people who'd never managed a classroom or dealt with the complex realities of diverse student needs. The night before leaving for Washington, I sat in my empty living room with a glass of wine and Tom's photograph, thinking about the unexpected paths that life creates when we're brave enough to follow them. 6 months earlier, I'd been a retired teacher settling into quiet routines centered around gardening and occasional social obligations. Now I was embarking on a new career that could influence educational opportunities for generations of students. Stephanie's wedding seating chart had been the catalyst for this transformation, her attempt to diminish me instead illuminating possibilities I'd never previously considered. The Nobodies table had indeed been the perfect assignment, not because it was punishment, but because it was exactly where I needed to be to remember who I was and what I had to offer. As I turned off the lights and locked the door for the last time, I thought about the strange mathematics of human interaction, how cruelty intended to subtract can sometimes multiply opportunities instead. Table 12 had been my launching pad, and tomorrow I would begin the next chapter of a story that was far from finished. Washington in early spring carried the kind of energy that made even cynics believe in possibility. Cherry blossoms lined the streets like promises, and the city hummed with the particular intensity of people convinced they were changing the world, one meeting at a time. My apartment near Capitol Hill was modest but comfortable, with windows that caught morning light, and a view of the dome that reminded me daily why I'd accepted this unexpected chapter in my life. The first months of consultation work proved more challenging and rewarding than I'd anticipated. Elizabeth Morrison's education reform proposal was ambitious in scope, addressing everything from teacher preparation programs to standardized testing alternatives to funding equity between districts. My role involved reviewing draft legislation through the lens of classroom experience, identifying potential implementation challenges that policy experts might miss, and suggesting modifications that would actually support effective teaching rather than creating additional bureaucratic obstacles. The work required skills I'd developed during decades of curriculum planning and administrative collaboration, but applied to questions with national implications. When the proposal included provisions for mandatory technology integration, I could draw on memories of students who'd struggled with digital literacy not because they lacked intelligence, but because they'd never had reliable internet access at home. When funding formulas favored schools with higher test scores, I could explain how such systems penalized teachers who worked with the most challenging populations, while rewarding those who taught students with built-in advantages. Elizabeth proved to be an exceptional collaborator, combining political savvy with genuine commitment to educational equity. During our weekly meetings, she would listen intently as I described classroom scenarios that illustrated broader policy implications, taking notes with the focus of someone who understood that details mattered when legislation affected real children's futures. "Your perspective is invaluable," she told me, during one particularly productive session where we'd worked through provisions for supporting first-generation college students. Most education consultants have either never taught or haven't been in classrooms recently enough to understand current realities. You bridge that gap in ways that make our proposals actually workable. The comment reminded me of something I'd learned during my teaching years about the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom. Policymakers often approached education reform like engineers designing bridges, focusing on structural integrity while forgetting that bridges needed to accommodate actual traffic patterns and weather conditions. My job was helping translate political intentions into educational realities that could survive contact with diverse students, overworked teachers, and underfunded schools. The most satisfying aspect of the work involved opportunities to amplify voices that typically went unheard in policy discussions. When Elizabeth's office hosted listening sessions with educators from across the country, I helped identify participants whose perspectives would challenge conventional wisdom about what schools needed to succeed. Teachers like Sarah, Frank's daughter, were invited to share insights about working with low-income students. Principals from rural districts described challenges that urban-focused policies often ignored. Special education coordinators explained how standardized assessments discriminated against students with learning differences. These sessions reminded me why I'd been drawn to teaching originally: the recognition that education worked best when it honored individual differences rather than imposing uniform expectations. The stories shared by participants created a rich tapestry of experience that informed every aspect of the reform proposal, grounding abstract policy goals in concrete human needs. Tommy Ningyan, the college student who'd sat at table 12, became something of a case study in our discussions about higher education access. His story illustrated how first-generation college students needed support systems that went beyond financial aid, addressing everything from academic preparation to social navigation of unfamiliar environments. When the proposal included provisions for comprehensive student support services, I could point to Tommy's experience as evidence that such programs were investments in human potential rather than expensive add-ons. The irony of Stephanie's seating arrangement continued to reveal itself in unexpected ways. Her attempt to surround me with people she considered insignificant had instead connected me with representatives of populations most in need of educational support. Frank's working-class perspective, Maria's single-parent challenges, and Tommy's first-generation college experience had provided exactly the insights needed to develop policies that addressed real barriers to educational success. As spring turned to summer, the education reform proposal gained momentum in ways that surprised even Elizabeth's experienced staff. Bipartisan support emerged from unexpected quarters, as senators recognized that the legislation addressed concerns from both progressive and conservative perspectives. The emphasis on supporting teachers attracted liberal backing, while provisions for local control and accountability appealed to conservative interests. Media attention followed political momentum, bringing interview requests and speaking opportunities that extended my influence beyond Elizabeth's immediate circle. I found myself quoted in major newspapers and invited to appear on television programs where I could explain how specific policy provisions would affect classroom practice. The experience of being treated as an expert, rather than a relic of outdated educational approaches, felt like vindication for every year I'd spent helping students discover their potential. The most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. A letter arrived from Grace Patterson's former high school classmates, now working as teachers across the country, expressing gratitude for having their perspectives represented in national policy discussions. Several mentioned that seeing their former teacher influencing education reform had inspired them to become more politically active in their own communities. Former students reached out through social media and professional networks, sharing stories about how skills they'd learned in my classroom had contributed to their career success. Reading these messages reminded me that teaching's influence extended far beyond test scores or graduation rates, shaping how people approach challenges and opportunities throughout their lives. The most touching correspondence came from students I'd taught during my early years at Bridgewater Academy, now adults with children of their own attending public schools. They expressed hope that my policy work would create better educational opportunities for their families, closing the gap between the elite private education they'd received and the public options available to most American children. David visited Washington during the summer, bringing news from Connecticut that illustrated how the wedding's aftermath continued to reverberate through family relationships. His marriage to Stephanie was surviving but strained, challenged by ongoing arguments about social priorities and family loyalty that had been triggered by her ill-conceived seating arrangement. "She's beginning to understand that the wedding didn't go wrong because you caused problems," David told me during dinner at a restaurant near my apartment. "It went wrong because her priorities were wrong, and your success afterward just made that more obvious." David's assessment suggested that Stephanie was finally confronting the consequences of her social engineering, recognizing that attempting to diminish others often diminished oneself instead. Her perfect wedding had indeed become memorable, but as a cautionary tale about the difference between class and cruelty rather than a celebration of sophisticated taste. Robert had apparently begun questioning other aspects of Stephanie's influence on family dynamics, noticing patterns of manipulation and control that extended beyond wedding planning to everyday interactions. The process of recognizing these patterns was painful but necessary, creating space for healthier relationship dynamics based on mutual respect rather than social positioning. "Dad said something interesting last week," David continued, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone he'd developed when processing complex emotional situations. "He said that watching you succeed in Washington while Stephanie struggled with the wedding fallout made him realize that real class isn't something you can fake or buy. It's something you either have or you don't." The observation reflected growth in Robert's understanding that I hoped would extend to broader family relationships going forward. Stephanie's attempt to establish social hierarchy through seating charts had inadvertently revealed the difference between authentic dignity and performed superiority, a lesson that would hopefully influence future interactions. As autumn approached, the education reform proposal was scheduled for committee hearings that would determine its legislative fate. Elizabeth asked me to testify as an expert witness, representing the perspective of classroom educators who would be most affected by the proposed changes. The opportunity felt like the culmination of everything I'd worked towards since accepting the consulting position, a chance to speak directly to senators about policies that could improve educational outcomes for millions of students. Preparing for congressional testimony required different skills than I'd used for conference presentations or media interviews. The questions would be more pointed, the political implications more immediate, and the audience more skeptical of education reform proposals they'd heard promised dramatic improvements before. I spent weeks reviewing research, consulting with teachers across the country, and practicing responses to challenging questions about implementation costs and expected outcomes. The hearing room was intimidating in ways that reminded me of my first day teaching, filled with important people who would judge my credibility based on how effectively I could communicate complex ideas under pressure. But sitting at the witness table, I felt prepared in ways that extended beyond factual knowledge to include deep confidence in the value of my perspective. The questions came from senators representing diverse constituencies and political viewpoints, each seeking evidence that the proposed reforms would benefit their constituents rather than creating additional burdens for struggling schools. I drew on stories from my teaching experience, examples from my policy consultation work, and insights from educators I'd met during listening sessions to provide concrete answers about abstract policy goals. When Senator Williams from Texas asked about implementation challenges in rural districts, I could describe specific scenarios from my conversations with teachers who served geographically isolated communities. When Senator Martinez from California questioned funding mechanisms, I could explain how the proposals would affect schools serving high-poverty populations based on my work with districts facing similar challenges. The most challenging moment came when Senator Brooks from Ohio suggested that the reforms were idealistic proposals disconnected from fiscal realities facing state governments. Rather than becoming defensive, I acknowledged the legitimate concerns while explaining how the proposal's emphasis on supporting existing teachers, rather than replacing them with expensive new programs, would actually reduce long-term costs. Senator Brooks, I said, feeling the confidence that comes from knowing your subject thoroughly, the most expensive educational policy is one that fails to work. When we support teachers effectively, student outcomes improve, dropout rates decline, and communities become stronger. The return on investment extends far beyond what budget analyses can measure. The exchange continued for several minutes, but I could sense that my response had shifted the room's energy. These weren't abstract policy discussions, but conversations about real communities, where effective schools made the difference between opportunity and stagnation for entire generations of families. Following the hearing, Elizabeth expressed satisfaction with how the testimony had been received. "You managed to make policy personal without being emotional, and practical without being boring," she told me afterward. That's exactly what these discussions need to be productive, rather than just political. The legislation passed committee with bipartisan support, moving to floor votes that would determine whether the reforms became law. Media coverage emphasized the unusual coalition that had formed around the proposal, bringing together teachers' unions and parent groups, urban superintendents and rural school board members, progressive activists, and conservative fiscal hawks. During the final floor debate, several senators specifically cited my testimony as evidence that the reforms had been developed with input from experienced educators, rather than imposed by political theorists. Senator Morrison's closing argument included a reference to Table 12 at David's wedding, describing how meaningful conversation had emerged from an unlikely gathering of people whose perspectives were usually ignored in policy discussions. The legislation passed both chambers with comfortable margins, creating a framework for education reform that prioritized supporting teachers while improving outcomes for students. Signing the bill into law, the president mentioned the importance of including practitioner voices in policy development, a recognition that felt like vindication for every educator who'd been dismissed as irrelevant by people who'd never managed a classroom. As the first year of my Washington tenure drew to a close, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me from Table 12 to congressional testimony. Stephanie's wedding seating chart had been intended as punishment, a reminder of my supposed insignificance in the face of her social aspirations. Instead, it had become the catalyst for the most meaningful work of my professional life. The Nobodies table had indeed been the perfect assignment, not because it was exile, but because it was exactly where I needed to be to remember my worth and discover new possibilities for service. Frank's dignity, Maria's resilience, Tommy's determination, and my own experience had combined to create something more powerful than any of us could have achieved individually. Elizabeth Morrison's decision to join our conversation had been the key that unlocked doors I'd never imagined walking through. But those doors had been opened by authentic engagement with important ideas, rather than calculated networking or social maneuvering. The connections formed that evening had endured, because they were based on shared values and mutual respect, rather than strategic advantage. Looking back, I could see how Stephanie's attempt to diminish me had instead created the conditions for extraordinary growth. Her social engineering had backfired spectacularly, not because of any revenge plot on my part, but because authenticity tends to attract recognition from people who value substance over style. The final irony emerged when David called to share news that Stephanie had begun volunteering with a literacy program for adult learners, apparently seeking ways to contribute meaningfully to educational causes, rather than just discussing them at social events. Her transformation wasn't complete or guaranteed, but it suggested that even people who'd lost their way could find paths back to purpose if they were willing to confront their own motivations honestly. As I prepared to return to Connecticut for the holidays, I thought about how much had changed since that ivory wedding invitation had arrived in my mailbox. The woman who'd driven to Riverside Country Club feeling uncertain about her place in the family was returning home as someone who'd helped shape national education policy. But the most important change wasn't professional recognition or political influence. It was the recovery of confidence in my own worth. The understanding that dignity couldn't be assigned by seating charts or diminished by social slights. Table 12 had taught me that the only person who could determine my value was me, and that true class came from how you treated others rather than how others treated you. The wedding reception that was supposed to put me in my place had instead reminded me that my place was wherever I chose to make meaningful contributions to the world. Sometimes the cruelest intentions create the most beautiful outcomes, and sometimes the people who try to write us out of the story end up providing exactly the plot twist we need to discover who we're meant to become. 3 years had passed since that transformative evening at Riverside Country Club, and I found myself standing in the same venue where everything had changed, but this time as an honored guest, rather than someone relegated to the margins. The occasion was Frank Kowalski's retirement celebration, organized by the country club's board of directors to recognize his 43 years of dedicated service. The irony of returning to the place where I'd been dismissed wasn't lost on me, especially since I was now being introduced as Dr. Margaret Chen, having recently received an honorary doctorate from my alma mater for contributions to education policy. The retirement party was everything Stephanie's wedding had pretended to be but failed to achieve. A gathering where genuine affection and respect created the kind of warmth that couldn't be purchased or orchestrated. Frank stood at the center of attention wearing a new suit that his daughter Sarah had bought for the occasion, his face glowing with the satisfaction of someone whose life's work was finally receiving proper recognition. Senator Morrison, now chairing the Senate Education Committee, largely due to the success of our collaborative reform efforts, had driven up from Washington specifically to attend Frank's celebration. She spoke eloquently about how the education legislation we'd developed together had become a model for other states, improving outcomes for millions of students while providing teachers with the support they'd needed for decades. During her remarks, Elizabeth made a point of crediting the conversations we'd shared at Table 12 as inspiration for the reform package's emphasis on dignity and respect in educational settings. Sometimes the most important policy insights come from unexpected sources, she told the assembled crowd. Frank Kowalski's wisdom about character mattering more than status helped shape legislation that's now improving schools across America. The comment drew enthusiastic applause from the diverse group of attendees, which included everyone from country club members to city council representatives to teachers from Sarah's school district. It was exactly the kind of inclusive gathering that honored contributions regardless of social hierarchy, proving that meaningful celebrations brought people together rather than dividing them into carefully calibrated status groups. Tommy Nguyen had graduated from college the previous spring and was now working for a nonprofit organization that provided college preparation support for first-generation students. He'd driven down from Boston specifically to attend Frank's celebration, bringing with him a photo album documenting his journey from uncertain scholarship recipient to confident advocate for educational equity. "Mr. Frank," Tommy said during the informal remarks portion of the evening, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd grown into his own potential. "Sitting at that table with you 3 years ago taught me that respect isn't something you earn through credentials or connections. It's something you give and receive based on how you treat people." The observation resonated throughout the room, reminding everyone present of the wedding reception where Frank's quiet dignity had provided a foundation for meaningful conversation, while elaborate decorations and expensive catering had failed to create genuine connection. The contrast between that evening and this one illustrated the difference between authentic celebration and performed sophistication. Maria Santos had also made remarkable progress since our initial meeting, having completed her nursing degree through a program designed for working adults. She now supervised the pediatric unit at Hartford Hospital, while raising her 3 children as a single mother, embodying the kind of resilience that made abstract policy discussions feel urgently personal. "Frank taught me that where you sit doesn't determine who you are," Maria said when invited to share her thoughts about his influence. "Your character determines where you belong, and people with real class recognize that immediately." Her comment drew knowing laughter from the audience, many of whom had heard the story of our table assignment and its unexpected consequences. The wedding reception that was supposed to have humiliated us had instead become legendary in local circles, as an example of how attempts to diminish others often revealed more about the people making such attempts than their intended targets. David appeared halfway through the celebration, having driven directly from his law office in downtown Hartford. His presence surprised me, since we'd only spoken briefly about Frank's retirement party during our last phone conversation. But seeing him navigate the crowd with easy confidence, stopping to chat with people from all walks of life, reminded me of the boy I'd helped raise before social pressures had temporarily clouded his judgment about what mattered most. "Aunt Maggie," he said when he reached my side, his voice carrying warmth that had been missing during the months surrounding his wedding. "I wanted to be here tonight because this feels like where our family's real story got back on track." The comment reflected growth in David's understanding of recent events that had taken time to develop but seemed genuine in its depth. His marriage to Stephanie had survived the challenges created by her social engineering, but not without significant changes in their relationship dynamics and shared priorities. "Stephanie wanted to come tonight," David continued, surprising me with information I hadn't expected. "She's been working with that adult literacy program for over a year now, and she says it's taught her things about education that she never understood before." The news that Stephanie had maintained her volunteer commitment beyond the initial gesture suggested genuine transformation rather than temporary image management. Adult literacy work was challenging and often frustrating, requiring patience and humility that couldn't be sustained through superficial motivation alone. "She asked me to give you this," David said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "She wrote it herself, no help from anyone else." I accepted the letter with curiosity rather than skepticism, recognizing that people were capable of growth when circumstances forced them to confront their own behavior honestly. The envelope was simple white paper with my name written in Stephanie's distinctive handwriting, lacking the elaborate presentation that had characterized her previous communications. The letter itself was brief but seemed genuine in its acknowledgement of how her actions at the wedding had been motivated by insecurity rather than confidence, fear rather than strength. She wrote about learning from her literacy students that education was about empowerment rather than exclusion, and that her attempts to create social hierarchy had revealed her own lack of understanding about what made people truly valuable. Most significantly, she apologized not just for the seating arrangement but for the months of subtle undermining that had preceded it, acknowledging that she'd tried to diminish my relationship with David because she'd felt threatened by the bond we shared. The recognition showed self-awareness that hadn't been present during our previous interactions. "She's different now," David said after I'd finished reading. "Not perfect, but different. The literacy work has shown her what education really means. And she understands now why your career was so important, and why your policy work matters." The transformation David described seemed consistent with what I'd observed about people who engaged seriously with educational challenges. Working directly with adult learners struggling to master basic reading skills provided perspective that couldn't be gained through academic study or theoretical discussion alone. Frank's retirement speech provided the evening's emotional centerpiece, delivered with the same quiet dignity that had impressed Senator Morrison during our first meeting. He spoke about the privilege of serving others, the importance of treating everyone with respect regardless of their status, and the satisfaction that came from knowing your work had made other people's lives better. "I've cleaned up after celebrations and disasters, helped people find lost items and lost hope, and watched this community grow and change over 4 decades," Frank said, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion underlying his words. The most important thing I've learned is that kindness costs nothing but creates wealth that can't be measured in dollars. The observation captured something essential about Frank's character that had made him such compelling company at table 12. His wisdom came from decades of observing human behavior in both celebratory and stressful circumstances, developing insights about dignity and character that academic study rarely provided. During the reception following Frank's remarks, I found myself in conversation with Dr. Patricia Williams, the new superintendent of Hartford Public Schools, who had implemented several pilot programs based on recommendations from our national education reform legislation. Her enthusiasm for the changes was infectious, describing improvements in teacher retention and student engagement that validated our emphasis on supporting educators rather than replacing them with technological solutions. The policy framework you helped develop has been transformational, Dr. Williams told me as we stood near the windows overlooking the Connecticut River. But more importantly, the philosophy behind it has changed how we think about educational relationships and community building. The comment reinforced my sense that the real impact of our legislative work extended beyond specific program implementations to broader cultural changes in how schools approached their mission. The emphasis on dignity and respect that had emerged from our Table 12 conversations was influencing educational environments across the country. Grace Patterson had also attended the celebration, bringing with her a small group of young professionals who worked in education policy at various levels of government. Seeing her mentor younger colleagues reminded me of watching former students develop into effective teachers, the satisfaction that came from knowing your influence continued through other people's good work. "This is where it all started," Grace told her colleagues as she introduced me, gesturing toward the dining room where we'd shared our first meaningful conversation. The education reform package that's now serving as a model nationally began with a conversation at a wedding table, where people with different backgrounds found common ground around shared values. The story had become part of the policy community's folklore, cited in academic papers and conference presentations as an example of how authentic stakeholder engagement could inform legislation more effectively than traditional lobbying or expert testimony alone. Our experience had demonstrated that the best policy insights often came from people closest to the problems being addressed. As the evening drew to a close, I stood on the terrace where Senator Morrison and I had first discussed education policy in depth, looking out at the same river view that had provided backdrop for so many important conversations. The physical setting remained unchanged, but my perspective on everything else had been transformed by the journey that began with Stephanie's misguided seating chart. The wedding reception that was supposed to have diminished me had instead become the catalyst for the most meaningful period of my life. The people Stephanie had dismissed as nobodies had proven to be exactly the voices needed to inform policy discussions that would benefit millions of students and families. The table assignment intended as punishment had provided the platform for discovering new purpose and possibility. Frank approached as I stood, contemplating the view, carrying 2 glasses of champagne, and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose life's work had received proper recognition. "Quite a change from 3 years ago," he said, offering me one of the glasses. "In all the best ways," I replied, accepting the champagne and raising it in a toast to the strange mathematics of human interaction that had brought us together. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Frank said, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "How Stephanie probably spent more money on those centerpieces than I made in 6 months, but the most valuable thing at her whole wedding was the conversation at our table." The observation was both funny and profound, highlighting the difference between expensive presentation and meaningful content that had defined the contrast between our gathering and the rest of the reception. True value couldn't be purchased or orchestrated, but emerged naturally when authentic people engaged with important ideas. As guests began departing, I realized that Frank's retirement celebration had provided closure for a chapter of my life, while opening possibilities for whatever came next. The policy work in Washington would continue, but my base would return to Connecticut, where I could maintain connections with people like Frank and Maria and Tommy, who kept me grounded in the realities that made theoretical discussions meaningful. The drive home took me past my old house, now occupied by a young family with children who played in the garden I'd tended for decades. Seeing their lights in windows that had once framed my own evening routines created a bittersweet sense of continuity, life moving forward in patterns that honored the past while embracing new possibilities. My current apartment in downtown Hartford was smaller than the house I'd shared with Tom, but it suited my needs perfectly while keeping me close to the communities where I'd built my career and relationships. The walls were decorated with photographs from Washington events alongside mementos from my teaching years, creating a visual narrative of how past experiences had informed present opportunities. The education reform legislation continued to evolve and expand, with new states adopting modified versions of our original framework while researchers documented improvements in teacher satisfaction and student outcomes. The policy work had become more than professional achievement, representing proof that ordinary people's insights could influence extraordinary changes when given appropriate platforms and support. But the most lasting impact of the Table 12 experience wasn't professional recognition or political influence. It was the recovery of confidence in my own worth, understanding that dignity couldn't be assigned by others or diminished by their attempts at social engineering. The seating chart that was supposed to have put me in my place had instead reminded me that my place was wherever I chose to make meaningful contributions. 3 years later, I could see how Stephanie's wedding had indeed been perfect, just not in the way she'd intended. Her attempt to create carefully calibrated social hierarchy had instead provided exactly the catalyst needed for authentic connections to form and important work to begin. The Nobodies table had become the place where something real happened, where policy ideas took root that would benefit generations of students and families. The cruel intentions that had motivated my original table assignment had inadvertently created the most beautiful outcomes, proving that character always rises to the surface eventually, and that true class reveals itself through how we treat others rather than how others treat us. Sometimes the people who try to write us out of the story end up providing exactly the plot twist we need to discover who we're meant to become. Standing in my apartment later that evening, I raised a final toast to Table 12, and everyone who'd shared it with me, grateful for the reminder that the best revenge isn't revenge at all, but simply the quiet satisfaction of living well and refusing to let anyone else define our worth. The wedding reception that was supposed to have been my exile had instead become my liberation, and I wouldn't change a single detail of how it all unfolded. 5 years had transformed everything. I stood in the same mirror where I'd once adjusted my navy dress for David's wedding, but now I was preparing for an entirely different kind of celebration. The reflection looking back showed a woman who had found her voice in ways she never expected, wearing a burgundy silk dress chosen for the National Education Hall of Fame induction ceremony, where I would be honored alongside pioneers who had shaped American learning for generations. The invitation had arrived 3 months earlier, bearing the seal of the American Educational Foundation and signed by luminaries whose textbooks had guided my own teacher training decades ago. The recognition wasn't for my classroom work alone, though my 35 years at Bridgewater Academy provided the foundation. It was for the policy transformation that had begun at Table 12, the legislative framework that was now improving schools in 43 states while serving as a model for educational reform internationally. Elizabeth Morrison would be presenting my award, a symmetry that still amazed me given how our collaboration had emerged from Stephanie's misguided social engineering. The senator had become a close friend over the years, someone who understood both the personal cost of public service and the satisfaction of creating meaningful change. Our professional partnership had evolved into something deeper, a mentorship that flowed both directions as we learned from each other's expertise and experience. The ceremony was being held at the Kennedy Center in Washington, a venue that reflected the national significance of education in ways that made my individual recognition feel both humbling and inspiring. Driving through the capital city where I now maintained a permanent residence, I passed monuments to leaders who had shaped American democracy, while thinking about how educational policy was equally foundational to the country's future. My Washington townhouse had become a gathering place for educators, policymakers, and researchers who were developing the next generation of school improvement initiatives. The living room where I'd once entertained senators now hosted monthly salons where teachers shared classroom innovations with foundation directors, where superintendents learned about cutting-edge research from university professors, where students like Tommy Nguyen connected with mentors who could guide their career development. Tommy himself had become a central figure in my extended professional family, having completed graduate school, and now directing a national program that supported first-generation college students through comprehensive mentoring and academic assistance. His success represented everything our education reforms had been designed to achieve, proving that opportunity and support could transform potential into achievement regardless of family background or economic circumstances. The program Tommy led had already served over 10,000 students across 15 states, with graduation rates that exceeded national averages by significant margins. More importantly, the students he worked with were developing the kind of critical thinking skills and social consciousness that democracy required to function effectively. They were becoming teachers and social workers, entrepreneurs and public servants, citizens who understood their responsibility to contribute meaningfully to their communities. Maria Santos had also exceeded every expectation that rigid social hierarchies might have imposed on her potential. After completing her nursing degree, she'd earned a master's in healthcare administration and now managed the pediatric division at one of Hartford's largest hospitals. Her 3 children were all excelling academically, with her oldest daughter recently accepted to Yale University on a full scholarship that would allow her to pursue pre-medical studies without accumulating debt. But Maria's most significant contribution extended beyond her professional achievements to the advocacy work she'd taken on for healthcare equity and educational access. She served on the state board that oversaw implementation of our education reforms, bringing the perspective of working families who needed schools to provide more than academic instruction alone. Her voice in policy discussions ensured that reform efforts addressed practical barriers that prevented students from reaching their full potential. Frank Kowalski had become something of a legend in his own right, not just for his decades of service at the country club, but for the wisdom he'd shared during countless conversations with people from all walks of life. After his retirement, he'd written a memoir about his experiences observing American society from the unique vantage point of someone who'd served its most privileged members while maintaining his own dignity and values. The book, titled Character Counts: Lessons from 4 Decades of Service, had become a bestseller and was now required reading in several university courses about sociology and American culture. Frank's insights about class, character, and authentic leadership resonated with readers who were hungry for perspectives that cut through political rhetoric to address fundamental questions about how societies should organize themselves. David and Stephanie's relationship had evolved in ways that reflected the broader transformations triggered by that fateful wedding reception. Their marriage had survived the initial crisis created by Stephanie's social engineering, but not without fundamental changes in how they approached their roles within the family and community. The couple that had once prioritized appearances over authenticity now devoted significant time and resources to educational causes and social justice initiatives. Stephanie's work with adult literacy programs had expanded into a comprehensive nonprofit organization that provided educational support for immigrants, refugees, and adults who had missed opportunities for formal schooling earlier in their lives. Her transformation from someone who weaponized education as a marker of social status to someone who viewed it as a fundamental human right represented the kind of personal growth that made forgiveness not just possible, but necessary. The nonprofit she founded had partnered with organizations Tommy directed, creating pathways for adult learners to pursue higher education while receiving the support systems they needed to succeed. The collaboration between these 2 individuals who had first met at Table 12 illustrated how authentic relationships could create synergies that benefited entire communities. As I prepared to leave for the ceremony, I reviewed the speech I would deliver upon receiving the award. The themes I planned to address had emerged from years of reflection about how meaningful change actually occurred, how individual choices created ripple effects that influenced broader social patterns, how dignity and respect formed the foundation for effective educational relationships. The speech would acknowledge the thousands of educators whose daily work in classrooms, libraries, and community centers created the conditions where learning could flourish. It would recognize policymakers who had the courage to prioritize evidence over ideology when making decisions that affected children's futures. Most importantly, it would honor the students and families who trusted schools with their hopes and dreams, understanding that education represented their best opportunity for social mobility and personal fulfillment. But the heart of my remarks would focus on the unexpected sources of wisdom that had informed our most successful reform efforts. I would tell the story of Table 12 not as personal triumph over adversity, but as illustration of how authentic engagement with diverse perspectives could illuminate solutions to complex problems. The seating chart that was meant to exclude had instead created exactly the conditions needed for inclusive policy development. The Kennedy Center was filled with educators from across the country, a gathering that represented the diversity and dedication of American teachers at their best. Seeing familiar faces from my policy work alongside strangers who had devoted their careers to similar goals created a sense of community that transcended individual recognition or achievement. Elizabeth Morrison's introduction was both generous and accurate, describing how our collaboration had emerged from unlikely circumstances but produced legislation that was now improving educational outcomes for millions of students. She spoke about the importance of including practitioner voices in policy development, using our partnership as an example of how academic research and classroom experience could inform each other productively. When I took the podium to accept the award, I looked out at an audience that included Frank and Maria, Tommy and David, Sarah Kowalski and Grace Patterson, along with hundreds of other educators whose work created hope and opportunity in communities across America. The moment felt like celebration not just of individual achievement but of collective commitment to the transformative power of education. My speech began with gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought me to this recognition, but quickly shifted focus to the broader lessons about dignity, respect, and inclusive leadership that had emerged from our policy work. I spoke about how the most effective reforms emerged from authentic relationships rather than abstract theories, how sustainable change required input from people closest to the problems being addressed. The standing ovation that followed felt like validation not just for my own work, but for the collaborative approach that had made our success possible. The applause represented recognition that meaningful change required diverse voices working together toward shared goals, that expertise came in many forms and from many sources, that the best policies honored both individual dignity and collective responsibility. After the ceremony, the reception provided opportunities for conversations that would undoubtedly generate new collaborations and initiatives. Young teachers approached with questions about classroom management and curriculum development. Graduate students sought advice about research projects that could influence policy discussions. Foundation directors explored possibilities for funding programs that would extend our reform model to additional states and contexts. But the most meaningful moment came when Frank, Maria, Tommy, and David gathered around me near the end of the evening, recreating the circle of conversation that had first formed at Table 12 5 years earlier. Looking at these four individuals who had each found their own paths to contribution and leadership, I felt overwhelming gratitude for the seating chart that had brought us together. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Tommy said as we stood together in the Kennedy Center's elegant lobby. "How Mrs. Walsh thought she was putting us in our place that night, but she actually put us exactly where we needed to be to change everything." The observation captured something essential about how transformation actually occurred, how attempts to diminish others often created unexpected opportunities for growth and connection. Stephanie's wedding seating chart had indeed been perfect, just not in the way she had intended. Her effort to create social hierarchy had instead provided the foundation for authentic relationships that produced meaningful change. As I drove home through Washington's illuminated streets, I thought about the journey from Table 12 to the Kennedy Center stage, from feeling marginalized at a family wedding to being honored for contributions to national education policy. The path had been neither linear nor predictable, emerging from choices to respond to cruelty with dignity, to exclusion with inclusive vision, to personal slight with commitment to broader service. The award I'd received represented recognition for work that had improved educational opportunities for millions of students. But its deeper significance lay in proving that ordinary people's insights could influence extraordinary change when given appropriate platforms and support. The policy framework that began with conversations among supposed nobodies was now serving as a model for educational equity around the world. 5 years after Stephanie's wedding, I could see how her attempt to diminish me had instead provided exactly the catalyst needed for discovering new purpose and possibility. The table assignment that was meant as punishment had become the launching pad for the most meaningful period of my life. Sometimes the cruelest intentions create the most beautiful outcomes, And sometimes the people who try to write us out of the story provide exactly the plot twist we need to become who we're meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.